Hello, I'm Kimberlie, and welcome to the weekend edition of the Native News Update. It's Friday, January 27th, and many of the stories you hear here can be found at IndianCountryNews.com. And here's the news for the day from the Associated Press and other Native news sources. Native American leaders called on the federal government to honor its responsibility to American Indians with continued financial support, but to grant them greater flexibility in handling their own affairs. On January 26th, Jefferson Keel, president of the National Congress of American Indians, delivered the State of Indian Nations address, held annually after the President's State of the Union. The wide-ranging speech touched on everything from education to public safety and energy independence. Keel called on Congress to pass the Save the Native Woman Act, which would give tribes greater authority over people accused of committing violent acts against women on Native land. He also urged action on bills that would increase self-determination for renewable energy development. But most of the address focused on issues on federal trust and self-governance. Keel said tribal leaders are concerned that federal budget tightening could result in cuts of 10 to 15% in Indian programs over the next decade. Speakers also urged Washington to act, noting that the issues they care about are neither Republican nor Democratic, but Indian issues. Tribal leaders praised the Obama administration's record on Indian affairs, saying the president had lived up to many of his promises to tribes. They also called on candidates to include Native communities in their discussions so Indian interests can be represented going forward.
The state of Indian nations is strong. Our nations are strong. Our people are strong. Like our sovereignty, the strength of our nations is our inheritance. The state of Indian nations, as I outline it today, should be defined by what we commit to right now to make the state of Indian nations even stronger in the years to come. We all know tribes have faced a difficult history. We're rising from harsh economic conditions to contribute to a more prosperous tomorrow. Tribes have been doing more with less for generations. Ensuring government flexibility will yield more efficient programs and spending because decisions will be made by those best in position to respond to the community needs. It will also relieve administrative burdens at the federal level. This message comes directly from tribal leaders. We went to them with one simple question: what can we do with what we have already without asking for more resources that will provide greater opportunity for Indians, create more impact for federal programs? And over the answer came back: we need freedom at the local level to best use our limited resources. We know what's best because we live in Indian country. We know where the needs are, when we know what works for our people. No one understands Indian life better than the Indian nations themselves, those people who live there daily. Give us the flexibility. Our nations are committed to the success of the United States of America. Let us realize that future together so that our nations thrive today and forever. Thank you.
First Nations from Alberta and the Northwest Territories added their names in support to a formal declaration opposing the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline and Supertanker project. In signing the Save the Fraser Declaration, a formal legal declaration that protects the world's most critical salmon rivers and the Pacific North Coast from the threat of oil spills posed by the proposed Enbridge oil pipeline and supertankers. The Yinka-Dini Alliance, which is made up of 6 nations in northern British Columbia, led the creation of the declaration in 2010. Since then, First Nations signing on to the opposition of the proposed Enbridge pipeline and tankers has snowballed to more than 100 First Nations in British Columbia, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories. The signing of this declaration comes after a long week of chiefs, elders, and community leaders from various communities presenting oral evidence to the Enbridge Joint Review Panel in Edmonton. Testimony given by various communities in Alberta echoed nations in British Columbia and outlined the serious concerns many First Nation communities had about the proposed route of the pipeline and its close proximity to waterways, culturally sensitive areas, and traditional hunting, fishing, and gathering sites in the province. Last year, South Dakota Representative Larry Lucas supported a bill that reduced state environmental oversight on proposed uranium mine operations in the southern Black Hills. This year, Lucas has signed on as a co-sponsor for legislation that would reverse that law. And Lucas said it is a contradiction he is willing to face to make sure the environment is protected. Lucas also said that Native Americans have expressed their concerns about uranium mining damaging water supplies. So Lucas signed on as a co-sponsor to HB 1098, which would restore to the State Department of Environment and Natural Resources the permitting obligation and authority for injection well uranium mines that was suspended by the legislation last year. The mining process in question is known as Insuit leach mining. It involves injecting treated water into the ground to collect dissolved uranium, which is then pumped back to the surface for processing. The Wisconsin Assembly passed AB 426, the Assembly Open Pit Mining Bill, on a party line vote January 26th, despite strong public opposition to the bill. The Republican House bill designed to speed up the approval process for mining in the Pinocchio Range was debated and voted on in the Wisconsin Assembly. After the House pushed the voting back for 2 weeks to give more time for discussion and possible bill alteration, many were still frustrated with the draft. Large protests were held in Madison to let lawmakers know they were concerned about the mine's impact on the environment. Many Assembly Democrats still believe that the bill is designed to benefit GTAC more than it should. Assembly Democrat leader Peter Barca stated before the Assembly vote that AB 426 would potentially harm our state's drinking water for decades to come. IndianCountryTV.com was on location in Madison during the debates and protest with live coverage.
The second punch to Wisconsinites and to the tribes today is in the form of the rollback of environmental protections. When you look at the rollbacks related to water, that's ultimately what this bill is about, is water. Deregulating protections for groundwater, wetlands, streams, creeks, allowing the dumping of toxic waste materials in these waterways is something that our tribe can't afford to risk. But that, if it becomes Wisconsin mining law, is coming to a town near you. And so today we're down here to bear witness and to try and wake up legislators before it's too late, that this type of legislative activity should not be occurring.
And with this mining bill, I have watched them ignore process, ignore democracy, and now they're going to pretend that there are no sovereign treaty rights. In fact, Representative Jeff Stone in the committee meeting this week said, we believe that Bad River believes they have these old rights, but we don't believe it, and so you're going to have to sue us because it's not our job to ask Bad River to the table. To me, that was an act of treason. This government has turned on us. Call the White House. It's 202-456-1414. That's the White House, 202-456-1414. People who have been calling have been saying various things, that they're very receptive to this, that they are urging us also to call the Department of Interior, the Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that's 202-208-3710, the Department of Indian Affairs.
And so we stand and fight against the pollution of our water, our air, and Mother Earth. And all we have to do is to travel different places. Travel out west or in Canada and witness those moonscapes that are the result of open pit mining. Now this is much more dangerous to the environment than what underground mining is. It's like apples and oranges. And so we've made up our mind. This mine is not going to occur. Miigwech, Mio.
To watch the complete rebroadcast of AB 426 coverage, you can go to IndianCountryTV.com. On January 24th, the Navajo Nation Council voted unanimously in favor of an act that protects vulnerable adults from discrimination, abuse, retaliation, exploitation, and neglect. If Navajo President Ben Shelley signs the act into law, the Navajo Vulnerable Adult Protection Act will be the first on Navajo land to protect vulnerable adults ages 18 to 54. Previously, Navajo law only protected children and elderly from abuse and neglect. An estimated 30% of adults ages 21 through 54 living on the Navajo Nation have disabilities. The Act protects adults from physical, verbal, sexual, and emotional abuse, and from neglect or abandonment. Specifically, it protects them from intimidation, threats, unreasonable confinement, or any other acts of cruelty. Native American Disabilities Law Center, a nonprofit organization that advocates for the legal rights of American Indians with disabilities, has worked for 6 years to draft the act. The act made it to the floor of the Navajo Nation Council 3 times before it was passed. The act, also known as the Doris Act, is named after Doris Dennison, a Navajo community activist who advocates for the rights of those with disabilities. Canada's Aboriginal Affairs Minister signed an agreement to reform First Nations education in British Columbia and says other reform partnerships are likely. The federal government, British Columbia, and First Nations reached what they're calling a historic education deal to provide First Nation students with access to quality education. In December, the Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples called for a complete overhaul of Canada's First Nations education system because reserve schools frequently operated in crisis. The committee's report, entitled Reforming First Nations Education from Crisis to Hope, says reserve schools operate in isolation without the necessary support. It also calls for the First Nation Education Act to establish legal power for educational authorities that would be accountable to parents and communities. Another report commissioned by the government and the Assembly of First Nations is set to be released soon. A joint panel is looking at options, including legislation to improve elementary and secondary education outcomes for children on reserves. Experts say reforming reserve education is a particularly complex issue because education was used to undermine Native culture in the past. Starting January 27th, gray wolves are no longer under federal protection in the Upper Great Lake region. That means states have a free hand to go after wolves that cause problems for people. Wildlife officials say delisting is long overdue, but court battles have blocked their efforts. Ongoing court challenges from wildlife protection groups have meant wolves have yo-yoed on and off the federal protected list. Now that they are no longer protected, Minnesota is considering hunting season for wolves, while Wisconsin plans to cut in half the number of wolves in their state. That's troubling to the groups that have fought to keep wolves on the endangered list, but they say they have no plans to mount another legal action. The Passamaquoddy have partnered with Exergy Development Group, headquartered in Boise, Idaho, to launch a $120 million wind farm in Maine. The developers estimated that the project will create 50 to 100 jobs during the construction phase and 115 to 20 permanent positions once the farm is built, with more jobs anticipated from spin-off developments in the future. Richardson, former commissioner of the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development and former Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, said the tribe plans on erecting between 18 and 50 turbines, depending on the results of an ongoing environmental study. They hope to generate between 36 and 72 megawatts of electricity. And according to the American Wind Energy Association, 1 megawatt of wind-generated electricity can power 240 to 300 households per year. Plans are to build and begin operating the wind farm in 2013. Chief Clayton Cleaves of the Pleasant Point Reservation said the tribe will retain 51% ownership of the project and will funnel those profits in additional projects in the Washington County. And that's another roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. I'd like to thank you for joining me and have a grand day.